Welcome to another edition of MORE, which is a recording that we do with our board and so on. MORE stands for Movement in Omaha for Race Equity. And with me on this edition is Doug Koebernick, who's Inspector General for the Department of Corrections. He's been in this position for over 5 years. He has his degree in political science and history, which are the same degrees that I got from University of Nebraska-Lincoln years ago. And at the time we started this, he was a single one-person operation in the Inspector General, but now he has a person who's working with him, so he can talk to me more about that. His job was established in 2015 by the Nebraska Legislative Judiciary Committee for developing accountability in Department of Correction, and he's been appointed to a second 5-year term, so we're excited about that. So, Doug, welcome to our MORE program, and I want you to maybe start off a little bit before we get there. I want to say, as a backdrop, I read your annual report, which was over 136 pages. I was struck by a series of questions, and it illustrated we have a dysfunctional and broken prison system in Nebraska. And I'm going to focus a little bit on race and class issues in this conversation or this interview or discussion, how we want to put it. But the other expectation is for us to help other participants who watch this or engage in these conversations to become involved in changing our draconian system. So with that out of the way, I want to just start off by Doug, tell the listening and viewing audience a little bit more about yourself, because I gave a very brief introduction of your accomplishments, who you are, and I like to have my guests do that themselves.
No, well, thank you for having me on here. I'm excited to be here and talk about what I do and talk about the correctional system. And like you said, in 2015, the legislature passed a law to create the Inspector General of Corrections position, and that resulted from work back in 2014 when they had a special committee that looked at the Nico Jenkins situation, and Steve Lathrop was the chair of that group. And they really dug in, and they not only looked at what had happened in the Nico Jenkins case, where he was in the correctional system, and there was a lot of things going on where he needed help and possibly didn't get it. And then he came into the community, and he had said when he got back in the community he was going to murder people, and then he came back and did that. So they did that, but then they looked at more issues going on in the Department of Corrections. And then at the same time as this was going on, the Omaha World Herald did a whole series of articles about things that were going on within the department. So it kind of mushroomed into this much bigger exercise and investigation, and they came up with a report. And then that report was what recommended the creation of this office. I was lucky enough in 2014 to be one of the staff members for that committee. Prior to that, I had worked in the legislature for about 16, 17 years as a legislative aide for various senators. And before that, I worked for Governor Nelson way back in the day, and did some different jobs for him. So I graduated from it was Kearney State College when I was there and graduated. I was in the last class of Kearney State College. It then became the University of Nebraska-Kearney. And so I've lived in Lincoln now for quite some time, and excited about this position. So in 2015, when the legislature created this, I was actually in a different position. Senator Lathrop had been term limited out, and I was working for Senator Burke Harr from Omaha. And I didn't really have an interest in this position or anything, but it was one of those things where people brought it to my attention. They thought having somebody who was kind of independent, who understood state government, who understood the legislative process, I think they thought that having somebody like that in that position would be a very, very good idea. And I know they had a lot of different applicants from different walks of life and everything, but they ended up picking me. I was reluctant at first to apply, but then I ended up doing it and I got the job. And so I've been doing that since September of 2015. And like you said, I was reappointed to a new 5-year term this past September. For 5+ years, I was the smallest Inspector General office in the country because it was just me doing all this work. And the legislature was kind enough to give me some funding where I hired an assistant inspector general in December, and that is Zach Pluhacek, who is, he's worked in the legislature, but before that, he was a reporter and an editor at the Lincoln Journal-Star, and he brings a wealth of experience as far as digging into issues, asking good questions, the ability to write and communicate well, and to edit work and everything. He has a strong, he spent the last 2 years working on a lot of correctional issues, so he's got a very strong background on that. So we're really excited. We've decided with having somebody new on board, and sorry for the long-winded answer, but having somebody new on board is giving us an opportunity for this office to really
Move,
expand its
move
work.
to another level, as we would say,
It
which is
really
good.
has. Just in the last month, we're doing a lot more than I've ever been able to do. And so
Good.
I'm really, really excited, and I'm glad to be on your.
Doug, after reading the report, I have a number of questions I want to raise to you, and I think we can kind of enter a dialogue. Also, it's not just like a straight interview, but in your report, you cite some numbers with racial composition at various sites and programs. Can you outline the prison population and the significant locations? Because sometime when I was reading that report, you use acronyms, and I think at the back of it you have that. But again, we're looking at the audience out there who may not be familiar with what the numbers are in our Nebraska state prison system, as well as the racial composition. Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. I think if we start on the men's side of the system, there's 10 prisons total. And the men first go into Lincoln at the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center, which is a facility where they kind of do an intake and an assessment of everybody, every man that comes in, and figures out what their needs are, what their custody level is, things like that. So that's in Lincoln. That has about 400 to 500 people in it. It was actually built for 160, so it's way over its capacity. Right next door to that is the Lincoln Correctional Center, and that is more of a kind of a medium maximum custody facility for men. There's some mental health um, um, units there, and protective management, and you have kind of a mix of populations there. So, and right now those their two facilities are actually being merged into one, and they're adding some additional treatment beds there. And then they also are in the process of adding 384 high security maximum custody type beds to that facility. So in a couple of years, that these two prisons will merge into one, and really will be probably the largest prison in our
Well,
system.
when we say numbers, what numbers are we talking? What's the raw numbers?
We're talking altogether, I would say we're talking about 1,400 men will be in that large facility.
So if we say in all of the facilities, what are we talking?
All facilities, we're talking about 53 to 5,400 right now. Also in Lincoln, we have the Nebraska State Penitentiary, which houses 12 to 1,300 men. You have one side that's a minimum custody that has about 600 or so minimum custody men, and then the rest of it's medium maximum custody. You have substance abuse treatment being provided there, residential programming. That's that older with the walls around it and everything that people see in South Lincoln. And then also in Lincoln, there's a community corrections center where people, when they're getting ready to release and they can eventually get into the community and work in the community, but stay there. There's men and women both are there. And that's about almost 700 people total in that facility. Then if you go to Omaha, there are 3 facilities. We have the Nebraska Correctional Youth Facility, and that has 68 beds for juveniles that were tried as adults. So it's primarily like 19 and under and everything. And right by that is the Omaha Correctional Center, which is a minimum medium custody facility for men that has between 700 and 800 people in it. And then across the street from there is the Community Corrections Center in Omaha, which is an all-male facility with 180 beds in it. So there are no female community custody beds right now in Omaha. And then we have 3 other facilities. One is the Tecumseh facility, which has a restrictive housing unit for people that are basically have done something and they're basically locked in their cells for about 23 hours a day, very, very limited movement.
Now, do we call that solitary confinement when you use that word? Because I've heard people use different terms for that. Is that what that means?
There's different terms that people use. They use solitary confinement, segregation, or restrictive housing. In Nebraska, we use restrictive housing. In state law, solitary confinement is defined as like no ability to see or hear from other people. And so since that definition is in in the state law, we don't really use that. So it's more restrictive housing. So that facility has about 1,000 people in it, men, and 200 of those are in those restrictive housing settings. And then you have 3 other housing units. York is a women's facility that has about 275 women in it right now. And then out in McCook, Nebraska, there's a small facility that was originally started as kind of a probation facility, and it has grown now, and it's run by the Department of Corrections, and it's a minimum custody facility, and it has about 200 men. So 10 prisons total, 53 to 5,400 total inmates, probably about 400 women, and the rest are men. About a year ago, we had around 5,700 people in the system. So there's been a decrease since then, and that's primarily been driven by COVID, by the pandemic.
Okay, we're dealing with COVID.
Local courts aren't able to get people through and try them and then send them over to the state.
There's a number of questions I'm see if I can get to. After reading the report, I was struck by the lack of movement by the direction of Department of Corrections on some of your past recommendations. This is not your first report, and I know by virtue of your job, you have to do this every year.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that slow? So particularly when some of the recommendations are elementary or common sense from the average reader's perspective. So again, why is that so?
Yeah, I started my first annual report was written in 2016, and I made recommendations in that. And each year I have the annual report. I make a number of recommendations. I also do smaller reports that are focused on just maybe 1 or 2 issues or a facility, things like that, where I make recommendations. And if you go through that, there are a lot that have not been acted upon by the department, and they have that discretion not to. One thing I have learned is that they can be resistant to outside people telling them what they think they should do. And that's kind of human nature and everything. But I've also found out that if I go back and look back a few years and see what I recommended, I'm learning more and more that they actually have been doing more of those things that they originally rejected. So that's encouraging. For instance, I'm working on a report right now that had some, I thought, pretty common sense recommendations as far as tracking when either staff or inmates have charges pressed against them because of like an inmate might have assaulted a staff member or something, and they or a staff member might be bringing in contraband drugs or something like that, and they end up getting charges provided to them by the county attorney, and the department really doesn't track like what the outcome of those charges are. So if we have like 100 staff that have been charges have been recommended for them because of something they did that was illegal within the prison, and they're not tracking it, so they don't know. Maybe only 5 of them were even prosecuted, and things like that. That would seem to be a really simple idea to do. Just make sure you're tracking what's going on, and that was rejected outright. And it's like, okay, but I would guess that in a year or two,
crazy. It's dysfunctional and crazy.
Yeah, in a year, I bet we see it from the department. But right now, they rejected it, and so it's kind of the dynamic that goes back and forth with us.
One of the things that hit me is that when I read the detail of your report, and by the way, this is the first time I read it in detail. I've seen it and read the summary and the executive summary you provide. What kind of community outreach engagement have you done to get more participation in terms of advocacy or helping to get outcomes from some of the recommendations? And this is direct in terms of what you're about.
Yeah, over the years, I've tried to engage with some community groups, whether they're advocates for the system or friends. There's a friends and family group that meets in Omaha. There's one in Lincoln that has met. There's a Reentry Alliance network that meets in Lincoln. So I've tried to reach out to them and other groups. It's been a challenge because of just time constraints on me because I was the only one. But right now I'm in the process of trying to put together a community advisory panel that would have people from different parts of the state, different parts of the, as far as their interest with the correctional system, people who've been incarcerated, family members of those who've been incarcerated. I have some like former psychologists from the department that provided programming that really want to get involved and provide insight for me so I can bounce things off, but also learn about what's happening. So that's something that is relatively new for me and I'm working on, and something I've realized for the last few years I need to do a better job of. I'm really hoping with having Zach on board, that's going to give us an ability for the two of us to get out more and get input from all the different communities involved with the correctional system.
So, Doug,
So,
let me ask you straight up then. How do you know how effective you are then? How would you know that? I mean, what kind of measurement tools or metric are you using? Again, that's something we ask ourselves, not only in terms of profession, but even privately.
you know, one of the ways that I can find out how I'm doing is I go out into the prisons and I talk to the people that reside in those prisons and also the people who staff that. So I try to gain input from them as far as what they're seeing from my office. Is my office being effective with them? I get a lot of letters and phone calls from people that are living in the prisons with various issues, whether it's classification issues or their ability to move to community or being in restrictive housing for 1,000 days or more, things like that. This last year, I had around 300 cases that I opened on
Wow.
individual complaints. This year, already in January, I'm on a pace to just leave that in the dust. So a lot of people reach out to me. So I think one of the ways I know that I think I'm having an impact is that I have a lot of offenders that contact me and say, I heard that you care about this system. I know that you try to help people and try to improve the system. I want to share my story with you, or I have a concern that I hope you can help me address. I also have a lot of staff that reach out to me on a regular basis and tell me what's going on, and they ask for assistance too. And then the other thing is too, I have the legislature that I report to. So I have 49 senators in the legislature. The two that I primarily report to are the Judiciary Committee chair and the Executive Board Committee chair. And so I kind of get feedback from them, especially the Judiciary Committee chair and the members of that committee. So Senator Lathrop, and then we have a bunch of other senators on there. Senator DeBoer, Senator McKinney is a new one. Senator Geist is a new member on the Judiciary Committee. And we have a few, Senator Pansy Brooks, Morfeld, Brandt, and Slama. So I reach out to them a lot and share information about what's going on so that they're informed, and then I kind of get feedback from them on how I'm doing. But
Right.
I'm hoping with this advisory panel that I'm in the process of creating that I will get even more input and better feedback and direction on where maybe this office should be going.
Right. Part of what I was reading the report, it was one of the things that jumped out at me. The other thing is I noticed that you did have some racial data in terms of composition, disproportionality, and proportionality of people of color in the system. And there were a couple of charts. I should have brought them and put them on here. Why is that racial data important to you, particularly as you listed in your report?
I think it's so important to understand who is being incarcerated in our system and why they are there. One of the things that really jumped out, we've always known that like Black men are going to be overrepresented in that system. That's just history over the last few decades. We've seen that, but you got to understand like what's driving that and everything. But then we look at all the different groups. One of the ones that really caught me off guard was the over incarceration of Native American women. Was like, I can't remember right now, I don't have it pulled up either, but 6 or 8 times higher than the Nebraska population of Native American women. So I thought, and I talked to a lot of people who are in those groups when I'm out in the facilities, and I just thought it was really important to start tracking that data and making more people aware, because there's really not a lot of reports that we see, if any, in Nebraska that get the attention that my report does. My report, at least I know people are looking at it. It's reported in the newspaper. It's on TV sometimes. And I just felt personally that that is an issue that we need to really dig into. And I wanted to start highlighting it. And plus, I was kind of shocked at some of the numbers I saw. I mean, some I wasn't, but others I was, and I just thought, you know what? If that's shocking to me, it's going to be shocking to other people, and it bears further investigation and really, I wanted to bring it to the awareness of the policymakers who read my report too, so that they're aware. The legislature, the governor, anybody else who reads that report and is involved with making policy, and maybe local policymakers, that they need to realize. how people are getting into our system and how they're overrepresented.
Right. And part of that conversation is if African Americans only make up 7% or 8% of the state population, why are they almost 40% or whatever those numbers are? The same thing, you look across the nation, you'll see a disproportionate number of people of color in prison and jail. And the other day I was at a meeting and I found out that they got young women and men in the young in YRTC and so on, who are in there for misdemeanors. I didn't know that. But again, I didn't know that until somebody brought the data to my attention. So again, there should be a warm handoff on how do we correct these things where we have judges or police officers who are over jealous or zealous about dealing with race as an issue when they arrest a criminal or potential criminal or alleged criminal, whatever. And then again, we have situations where we have whites who get a kind of a warm handoff where they don't get brought into these systems. The other thing
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, go ahead, sorry.
Another thing about related to that I started looking at this last year too was when those groups are in the correctional system, what happens? How are they treated? Are they treated differently within the correctional system? Do we have more people in segregation or restrictive housing of a certain makeup than others? Do they have chances to get to minimum custody and the community and work release and stuff? Are there differences in how these groups are treated that way? I mean, as far as opportunities for transitioning and reentry and education and job training, things like that. So as you can tell, I get a little fired up because I think that is huge. And we've got to, as a state, we have to have an understanding of whether or not our correction system is treating people fairly and equitably and are giving them the same opportunities. And if the color of your skin is impacting those opportunities. So that is something I really want to dig into, and that's why I'm excited to have my assistant IG on board, because we have the capability, I think, to dig into some of those issues and raise it and find out maybe there's nothing there, but we need to know.
Well, take it from me, there is something there. We do have to call white privilege, racism, anti-racism, and all these other things that go on in our society. And systems, institutions are just like the individual. So the part of the data shows us that something is wrong and we have to correct it, because again, it doesn't make sense for two young people or people in general to commit the same crime, and one based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity or their nationality to get double the sentence. And particularly in the cases where we talk about non-victimless crimes or issues where somebody might deal with a little marijuana or whatever, you want to throw the book at them, or as one officer said, I let them empty my pocket. Again, I think he forgot I was in the room because I'm not keeping those secrets. The other thing I want to get back to is how easy was it for you to get this racial data? Because in the work that I see and the reports I've read, a lot of systems and point people, and particularly white folks who are afraid, don't know how to talk about race issues and anti-racism, ignore it, or they feel this sense of guilt trip or whatever you want to call it, white fragility. But my question is, how easy was it for you to get those numbers of inmates? And how do many people think about some of that stuff? Now, again, you see it from a white perspective, or white eyes, or a Lincolnite, or whatever, but I see it differently. So my point is, how did you get the data? And then number two, what are some of the reactions that you've seen in your own job from other folks who see some of this information in your reports?
That data is actually pretty easy for me to get. The department does a really good job. I'll give them a lot of credit because they document and they track a lot of different data and everything. So it's pretty easy to get it, and they can break it down by, each facility. I need to look in at as far as like each custody level, maximum custody, medium custody, things like that. So the data was pretty easy to get. They even track, well, the state actually tracks employees, like the racial breakdown of employees.
The guards, you mean?
Yep.
The guards, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so
what they got, like 4 guards or 5 African Americans and 3 Hispanics? I mean, what are the numbers? They're not equal to the population, right?
No, they're not. But they're when I first looked at this back in 2016, I thought that was a really important thing to look at, because you go somewhere and you primarily saw a lot of white people guarding people
of color.
And I was curious, how many did we have? Once upon a time in a judiciary committee hearing or a special committee hearing, the Diane Sabatka Ryan, who was the deputy director of the department at the time, and now is the number 2 person, the chief of operations, she was asked by a senator, how many people of color are in the central office by you? Or minority, or it was like minorities or something like that. And she started naming like women. And they said, no, that's not it. And then she kind of said, well, I don't know. And that raised awareness to me, because how can you not know who works with you and everything? And I could, in my head, I was going down her hallway and figuring out, I mean, I had the answer, but those are important things. And so I started looking at this data to see, and I started making recommendations to the department that they need to do a better job of reaching out to some of those minority communities and hiring people. I'm encouraged because they actually have seen some increases in that. Um, so that's good. They have a ways to go, but it is better than it was 5 years
When you
ago.
walked
So
in the door.
yeah, and so but so looking at that data, I haven't really heard much feedback from people about how they feel about that part of my report. I have had a few people contact me, and they were really surprised, especially on the women's side of it and everything. Um, I hope it's helping people understand that there is a problem out there that needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at, and you got to get to the root of it and everything. But it's a system issue for sure.
Right. And we have to go upstream, Doug, to deal with it. You know, something else that came to mind is when you're, and I look at your report, I noticed that Black inmates are overrepresented in TSCI and NSP. First,
Mhm.
explain those programs. You talk a little bit, and every time they're, according to your report, you say there's 6 times the ratio. You also talked about the Native American, which you alluded to earlier. And so my point is, how do we reverse these numbers? And then those two locations, what does that really mean in terms of people of color being overrepresented?
Yeah, TSCI is Tecumseh's prison, and NSP is the state penitentiary. So those are the two prisons with the most like maximum custody beds for men. So those are where, that those are the hardest edge prisons, really, the toughest prisons. And so I thought it would be really important to look to see what the proportions are within those two prisons. And what I saw is that especially the Black men are very overrepresented in those two facilities, which then led me to that whole thing that I talked about before, where, okay, well, what's happening at the lower custody levels with minimum and community? Are men of color getting stuck in those maximum custody,
Right,
medium custody beds and not being able to penetrate and get out and transition out as easy as other ones?
right.
Um, so that raises the question of, okay, that clearly is must be happening to some extent. So by raising it, I thought it was important for the department really needs to be looking at that and saying, okay, what are we doing? Are we doing something that's causing that, or what's the cause of that? Are there programs that we can bring in to work with those groups? And we got to figure out a better way of addressing these issues and everything. So a lot of times I raise those concerns with the hopes that the department or others will then act on those. Um, I haven't received any feedback whatsoever from the department from my report in September, so I don't know what they think about that.
Wait, hold on. Here's a question I'll throw. This is kind of like we call a audible. Did they even read it? Because one of the things that I found out years back when you're teaching at the university or college level and sometime and you ask a question, you can tell quickly that some people haven't read it or they don't have the bell curve, or we call it the bandwidth, to even discern it. And then sometimes they're so embarrassed. So one of the things I'm always saying is that sometimes people raise their hand, that's because they know the answers. But sometimes I even question if people even read my letters, because I see they don't respond and their eyes glaze over because they just haven't dealt with the subject matter.
I know I believe that Director Frakes and some of the people around him have read it. I know for sure that they looked at it to some extent, because there was a member of the media who was looking at something in it, and they pointed out, they kind of questioned how I went about doing something in there. So I was like, oh, okay, they did read it. At that point, they missed, and it was a really interesting part of the report. So I was glad. I'm like, okay, I know they read it now. And Director Frakes has told me in the past that he's read it and everything. And usually what I do is give him um, like a spreadsheet with all my recommendations at some point before my next report, and then he gives me an update on where they're at. With COVID and everything this year, I did not give him the whole list from the 2019 report. I just gave him kind of what I thought were the major ones to get some feedback from him. Um, but yeah, you kind of wonder sometimes if they read it. Probably the people who read it the most are the men and the women who live in the facilities. Um, because I've had
When you,
people,
the way you use that, it's almost like you got a little. If somebody else I know who does that, you mean the people who are the inmates, the ones who are the
yeah,
prisoners, right? Okay,
mhm,
for a minute I'm like, okay, is
yeah,
this a hotel you talking about? No, it's a prison. It's corrections. They
I
live
don't,
in the
it's
facility.
always tough to
They
know
live
what
in a
words they
prison,
use.
man.
Yeah, I mean, inmates, some people don't like that word inmate and everything. And they are living and residing there and everything. And I get feedback. I've had people call me up a few days after I put out the report. Like an inmate from the penitentiary calls me up and says, "Hey, I'm reading or my dad is reading your report to me over the phone." And I'm like, wow, okay. And then so that's always interesting. And people will make copies and mail it in and
Wow,
everything. Then it gets circulated. So I have a lot of people when I'm walking around there that come up to me and say, "Hey, I read your report." And
wow.
I mean, and also just yesterday I dropped off, I was late in doing it this year, but they have libraries at each prison.
Oh, they
Um,
have copies of it there.
and I make a copy and put it in a binder for each of the 10 library prisons and give that to the department, and then they put that in their library so that people check those out and everything. So I dropped all those off yesterday, but that's always interesting. And I would even say this too for anybody watching this: if you um, they always need more books at those libraries, and they have they have like the actual physical library that people go in and check books out from, and then they have little traveling carts that go into some of the units where guys can't get into the library. And if you have a lot of extra books, all you have to do is call the department central office and say, "Hey, I have some books I'd like to donate," and they can set you up. And I've collected books in the past, so it's a way to help out people inside, because they kind of run out of things to read sometimes and
You know,
everything.
I did not know that. I'm 65 years old. I'll be 66 February the 5th. I love to tell people that my birthday. I don't know why. It's one of those things. But I've always donated old books or books that I'm no longer using to friends and family of the library or the library people. But I didn't know the corrections took donations of books. So there are a lot of people who are doing Kindles like I'm doing, and so they don't buy as many books, or they're starting to get older and they want to get rid of books. So we have this thing in our society, we don't like burning books, even when they're used or whatever. So you're saying that the Nebraska Department of Corrections take donations of books from people in the community for the inmates?
Yeah, which is a great thing.
That's
And
top secret, by the way. I was with the group for years who was Catholic Charities dealing with that, and I never heard that they actually received donations. So I'm glad to hear that. I didn't know that was there. So yeah, let's throw that out as one of our tidbits. I want to see if I can get through a few of these questions before our time runs out here. I noticed that you talked a great deal about I think I was the harsh conditions for the prisoners and nonviolent inmates in their lengthy prison terms. Like some of that goes back to the judges, obviously, and I'm not going to pull any punches with some of the racism in our judicial system. Obviously, we can see that on the national level as well as locally. And also, you advocate for continued for the guards. In other words, and I couldn't understand why would you be talking about supporting the guards when your focus is trying to make living conditions for the inmates better. So there's a thread there, but I don't necessarily understand as well as I could. So I want you to talk to both of those things. Nonviolent inmates, why they're in there so long, and then why are you talking about helping guards out in our prison system in Nebraska?
yeah, the correctional system has so many pieces of it that all kind of mesh together. And if you want a system that is operating to its fullest, you've got to have all the parts working well and support and everything. Um, right now I'm blanking out on what I put in my report on the nonviolent. I looked at it earlier and I can't
Well, you,
remember.
you you talk about the length of time someone get, and I don't know
Oh,
if it's
yeah,
three
I had the
times strike
example.
you're out or whatever, but you got people in jail, prison for nonviolence or marijuana or whatever, and they didn't kill anybody. I understand even when somebody kills somebody, you give them so much time, but it's weird reading that in your report.
Yeah.
Some of those anomalies or disparities, and I'm like, you got some judges who hate people, and the judges can make a lot of decision on how long you get, and some of them have some rules they say they have to follow.
Yeah, one of the examples that I remember. Thank you. I put some examples in there this year, because I had a case come across my desk with a guy who's basically he was a habitual criminal, meaning he'd been in prison a few different times, but they were very low level offenses, like a little burglary or
Right.
things like that. And then he was on parole. He shoplifted like geez, it was less than like a $10 item up in Fremont. And there's even question about whether he did that, but he just pled guilty to it just to get it to go through the process because he was getting like a 10-day county jail sentence. So he thought that was it. And then they revoked his parole and put him into CUMSA. And he's like a 70-year-old man. And they put him in the maximum custody facility, and which made no sense. And he'd been in for a long time. But then looking at that, you find some other ones that had been in for quite some time. Yesterday, I talked to Dr. Hamilton, Zach Hamilton, and Dr. Spahn from UNO. And Dr. Hamilton is the federal government contracted with him to come up with an assessment tool for the First Act program to identify people like that, individuals and others in the federal system, to identify who would be a good candidate for release, early release, based on different things as far as their makeup or their background and things they've done and everything. So I was really intrigued by that. So I'm going to kind of look into that more. And then as far as looking at like the guards, the correctional officers and the staff and everything, there's over 2,000 employees in the correctional system, and they are put in some really difficult positions. And for a long time, we've been having really difficult problems with turnover, really high rates of staff turnover. And there's a few things that can drive that. One is compensation. Their compensation wasn't where it really needed to be compared to the county jails and everything. And
But wait,
also,
hold on. You're saying if you work for a county jail, you make more than somebody who works in the Department of Corrections?
you
What are we
did.
talking numbers? I have no clue what people make in terms of money or hour or anything. What are we talking? Do you have a ballpark number?
You
A
know,
per figure? Thousands of dollars an hour or what? What are we talking?
we're talking thousands of dollars in annual salary. A few years ago, like Douglas County, an entry level position, I'm trying to think, was probably about $22 or $23 an
Walking
hour.
in the door
In
as a
the
job, new
Department of
person.
Corrections was about 17
Wow.
or so.
Okay.
So there's this difference. And even then, as you move through the ranks, like I had a guy who's still in the department. He's been a major, so he's very, very high, highest ranked security position. He's been in the department for 30 some years. His son went to Lancaster County Jail, entry level, and within like 5 years, he was making more than his dad.
Wow.
Been in the state system for 30 years. So, and then the other thing that I found early on was, if I was in the state system, so let's say I'm a corporal in the state system, and I've been in that position for 10 years, and then my neighbor Joe comes in as a corporal, and it's his first day on the job, we basically are making the same amount of money. So there was no reward for experience at all, and no step pay plan. And
Okay.
I was strongly recommending for that over the years in front of the legislature, anybody who would listen, because my thought is, if you pay your staff well, you're going to get a higher
Better quality.
and that's going to help out the living conditions within and how people are treated and assisted and everything during their stay, their incarceration within the correctional system. I am glad to say that steps have been taken recently to elevate those salaries and then to set up that longevity or step pay plan and to recognize experience. So I'm hopeful that we still have staffing problems. I think if that stuff had been done 5 years ago when I first said it, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are now as a system.
With the negativity that's keep floating in the news all the time because of all these craziness.
Yeah.
Other thing is, I noticed that one of the things that in your report you allude to, some of the inmates are angry because the prison administrators are not clear with their release dates. It seems like there's no systematic transition for many inmates to either community corrections, or sometimes they're forced to stay beyond their mandatory services. And my question to you is, why is that in a place that's supposed to have computers and tracking and everything else? I mean, you've been so many years in that system, you're ready to get out, and these folks don't have their act together in terms of programming and release. What's going on down there?
Yeah, what I meant by that was that this last year in 2020, I really took a lot of time looking at, had a lot of people contacting me about how they're trying to work through the system. So I really spent a lot of extra time trying to gain an understanding of, okay, if I'm at the state penitentiary and I have 4 years left before my parole date or before I jam out, which means I just walk out that day. how do I get from that point to a work release opportunity in community correction center where I
By
can
the way,
start?
hold on a second. Use the word jam out. I heard that years ago and I didn't know what it meant until somebody explained to me, what is
Yeah,
jam out? We talk about jam or what? What does that mean?
jam out means to just, you jam your sentence, and that means my sentence is over. So let's say um, I have a sentence that's a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 5 years. So I got to do, like, I don't have any parole opportunity. And my sentence just ends on a certain date, and I walk out that day. Or maybe I was eligible for parole, but I don't get parole. But there's always going to be an end date to my sentence. And if I haven't been paroled by that time, I just walk out that day, and they can't keep me any longer.
And that's jamming.
That's jamming.
But it also means you have no oversight or supervision as you go back to the world. You're by yourself then. Whereas if
Correct.
you don't jam out, there's usually somebody who can work with you
Mhm.
in terms of the transition of you getting back into the regular society, as we would say.
Right, right. And that's a big difference too. I mean, you have to have, having somebody on parole, there is somebody kind of keeping tabs on them. There's maybe a higher level of accountability. There's programs that might be available to them or other resources. If you jam out, there's also resources available, but you don't have that parole officer where you
Or
have
like a supervisor to helping you with your transition. Because it is, if you've been in that system for any length of time, there is a need to help people readjust to society they left when they've been gone for a certain significant amount of time.
So this last year, I looked a lot about how you get through that system and everything, and what the department does to prepare you. And what I learned is the last few years, the department's been saying that they're getting everybody their programming that has done what they, as far as if they behave themselves and everything, they're getting into the programming that they need, that's been identified for them by the department and the board of parole to get out once they hit that parole date. But the problem is that I found, and it gets a little confusing, but basically, um, we need to prepare people earlier, was my finding. That we need, if Doug needs substance abuse programming,
Right.
everything, I shouldn't get it right before I parole or have my
Walk out the
parole
door.
eligibility date. I should have that at least a year before that point, and then have a plan so that I can get through that. Lay it out with me, like say, okay, we know we're going to get you into your programming 2 years before your parole eligibility date. That's going to take this much time, and then we're going to step you through the system so that within a year before your parole eligibility date, you have an opportunity, if you are doing what you need to do, to get to community correction center. And right now we have a lot of people that could really benefit from a longer transition and a more thoughtful transition and an opportunity in that community corrections facility. And that's what I was kind of pointing at.
But by the way, Doug, I did see in the report, and maybe it was me, my oversight. I like to tell people I graduated from public school, so I don't read as well as people should. That's a crack on them. It's just a joke, really. Um, did you list how many people jam out versus not? Is that of concern to us? In other words, there are some people would say, I don't want you looking down my shoulder. Once I've served my time, leave me alone. So even though you made an argument for parole and helping people out, do we know the exact numbers of jamming in and jamming out? And is that reported in the state reports, or is that just your report, or what? Help me with that one.
Yeah, I think Senator Bob Christ, I think he had a law a few years ago that said the department had to do a report, a mandatory discharge report. So it showed who mandatory discharge is, that jamming function.
Okay.
So they have to report every year how many people jammed out. Now, the good thing is, because that number was high, that was one of the things we kind of found in that Nico Jenkins special committee and everything. So what we've seen over time is that number has gone down, but part of it is the legislature made some changes too. So people who receive certain sentences, they actually, when you enter the system, there's 3 ways you're going to get out. One is you get paroled. So then you have parole supervision over you, watching over you. The other one is you jam out. You just hit the end of your sentence. You walk out, no supervision. And then there's a third one that they created called post-release supervision. And it's when you get sentenced, at such and such a date, you're going to get released for post-release supervision. And that's actually done by probation. So we have parole, probation, both doing supervision after they leave the department. So because we've added that, there's more people getting, right now, more people come out and go to probation supervision than parole supervision. Not
Oh,
many
wow.
people know that.
By the
And
way, you did attack or challenge the parole board and their ineptitude, basically, of not releasing more people based on some numbers. I mean, I don't know how we fit in Nebraska, whether our parole officials are lazy, incompetent, or whatever. But I know I've had problems for years, and the reason I can say this is because I've met some of them, and they were not serious, or they were part of the Friends of the System. But you're very professional where you laid it out. You didn't say what I just said, but shouldn't they have some kind of accountability and standards that they're trying to get people out? Again, I know you got to be careful because you don't want somebody to get out, do something crazy, and you feel like it happened on your watch.
yeah, there was a case, oh, what is that? About 2 years ago, that a guy, he was supposed to get his violence reduction program, and he didn't complete that, but they paroled him out. And that was a risk by them because he hadn't completed that program. But the thing was, he was gonna jam out. He was gonna walk out like 6 months later. So the board had this really difficult decision. Do we parole him out so that somebody actually watched him for a while and get him into the programs he needs to support him in the community? Or do we wait and he can just walk out and he has no supervision? And in that case, he paroled out. They had supervision. He was taking some classes. He had a job. He was doing some program. But then he got involved with a woman and he murdered her. And so that parole board's in a really difficult position. I mean, for me, it's like, if I was those folks on that case, I would have been tempted to parole him too, because I'd rather have somebody watching him when he's got a certain risk level
Right.
and everything. But about 20 some years ago, when I was working in the legislature, we did a lot of corrections work with Senator Dwight Peterson. And um, I did some data crunching back then, and we found that people who had jammed out um, and left without any supervision, they actually did not come back at the same rate as the people who were paroled out and had supervision. And part of it is because if you have somebody watching everything you do, I might just goof up a little bit here and there. Like I might, who knows what I might get in trouble, have a little argument with somebody, or get in a fight, or get pulled over while drinking or something, and that's going to send me back. But if I don't have a parole officer watching me, that's just a hiccup, and
Right.
nobody
Right.
knows and stuff. So um, the parole board has had fewer people in front of them over the last few years because we have more of those people going to that probation side.
Okay, and that explains part of that then.
Mhm.
Other thing was in your report, you talk about director of correction have such a high salary. And clearly, when you compare to other directors in this region, I said he's not as competent based on your report and the state senator's comment over the years. I've heard Senator Chambers and them when he had those hearings and they asked some basic questions, and it was embarrassing the response, even some of the reports that came out from Marshall Lux and so on. And my question is, why does this director of corrections have such a high salary in contrast to other people in our regions? What's going on there?
Well, that was a decision made by the governor a few years ago. He didn't come in. His salary when he first came in was pretty high compared to the other ones, but it was in the ballpark as Kansas and Iowa, but higher and everything. The governor made the decision that he wanted to pay him more. He pays his health and human services director pretty well too, compared to some of those other states. And then, when was it? A year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. The governor gave him a big raise from, I don't know, about $190,000 to $250,000
Wow.
and everything. And I think that was meant to keep him around and everything. And the governor's a big supporter of the director. And if you think about what that person's in charge of, they probably do deserve a pretty good salary. But the reason I brought that in my report and raised that was because, like I said before, we had the salary issue where people weren't getting paid compared to the community, to the county jails and everything. And then we also have some wage compression issues that have developed lately, where we did reward those frontline staffers and they got more money, but now they're making more money than the people that supervise them because we haven't done anything for that group of people.
Right.
And as you work up the food chain, the salaries are very compressed. So my point was we should be paying our wardens and deputy wardens and other people a little bit better too. So reward them for their hard work, but and attract and retain good quality people, because pay is always a component of that. But you also have to have a good work environment too, and that's another factor that goes into it. So I was trying to point out, like, okay, the governor rewarded Director Frakes with this additional funding and the salary and everything, but we need to look at all the other people too within the system, because they aren't paid a comparable wage and
Right.
stuff. So
You know, the other thing is I had a chance to hear him speak at Highlander or at 75 North when he was up there about a year or so ago. It was my first time ever meeting or seeing him being in the same room with him. He's been in the job for years, but I would even venture that might have been his first or second time in North Omaha. You'd think somebody in that position, he would have a satellite office in both North and South Omaha, where a high percentage of his constituents or the people he served live or reside. And again, if we're going to talk about correction reform, progressive correction, pedagogy, whatever, you would think he would be a known commodity. But like, it's my first time seeing him. And he talked that day. But my question is somewhat, are you aware of him coming out of the walls, talking to other people in other grassroots community in other parts of the state? I understand Omaha is not the center of the universe, but what about other communities? Do you know anything about him getting out of those ivory tower walls? I mean, that's a strange word to call a prison ivory tower.
yeah, I think I don't keep track of him too much. We don't interact too often. Um, but I know he was out in McCook recently and talked to a
Okay.
community group out there. I saw him speak at a like a Rotary Club that I was invited to, where he was the guest speaker a while back. But I really don't. I don't know how much he's out there. He used to go to like the Friends and Family in Lincoln group, and I think he went maybe a couple of those groups, but I'm not sure how often he does that anymore, to be
Right.
honest.
In the one of the things that I heard in different capacities that we have a lot of inmates who have mental health conditions. You know, again, you even have the county attorneys and people complaining that there are people who are in jails and prisons who have no right to be there because they're mentally ill, and so we that becomes our new norm of putting people who you know are literally not well. And again, county attorneys, practitioners, why do we continue to put people with severe mental health problems in prison jails when it's obvious they need treatment or they need drug treatment, whatever?
Yeah,
Why?
yeah, that's a state issue, but that's also a country issue because that's happening in a lot of states. Everything, and I'll give Director Frakes some credit on this one because I mean, he's talked about the need to do more in the community for mental health services, um, and even to beef up. You know, we have Lincoln Regional Center that has some mental health treatment beds, but they haven't increased those beds for quite some time. So you have people that have needs and everything. And what happens is the default, it becomes the correctional system. Um, if we would do more on the front end and in the community, I think we would see better outcomes if we had places for people to go.
Mhm.
And as a result, I mean, like Mark Foxall used to run Douglas County um, County Jail. You know, I know he said, you know, that's the largest mental health facility in Douglas County was the jail, and it's the same thing with the state prisons and that. And then part of the, like right now, I just sent out a survey this morning to all the people who provide mental health treatment and clinical programming within the department because I wanted to get feedback from them. I want to get a better understanding of the challenges they face and things that they think are going well or not. So I blasted that out this morning. And one of the things though, when I was compiling the list of people who provide those services, I had like the master list of all the employees, and there's a whole bunch of positions that aren't filled. So we have all these people with mental health issues, and the department wants to work with them. I think they have some good psychologists that want to help, but we don't have a psychiatrist in the Department of Corrections right now. And we have a lot of psychologists and mental health practitioner positions that are vacant. And, you know, so that's definitely a challenge within the system, but we do need to do more in the
You know,
community.
we're getting down to the end, and I wanted to
Time
oh,
flies, Ajmal. Jeez.
say it again.
Time flies. I didn't
Well,
realize.
I'm track of time. I'm the moderator. I'm the facilitator. I'm the host in one sense. So I got to keep track of time as we do it to stay within our zone. You know, in
Okay.
the past few years, we've heard police officials say the crime rate is going down. yet our prison population is overpopulated in Nebraska. Can you explain those economies? And would it be fair on my part to blame the judges for being overly racist or demonstrating class welfare against the poor?
Mhm. Yeah, it is an interesting thing that I've been putting in my report, and it's got some attention from people where they all assume that these, crime rates are going up like this, and that's why all these people need to go to prison. That's why our prison population's growing and everything. But in reality, over the last 20, 30 years, you've seen our crime rates either decreasing or plateauing. And right now we've seen just a slight increase, a little bit on some crimes and stuff for the last couple of years. So there's been a slight uptick, but not compared to where it was at one point. But meanwhile, our prison numbers, like you said, are continued to climb until COVID hit here. Um, I the answer to that, and we're lucky right now because the state crime commission now has the capability to look at this data more closely, and they have a guy over there, Mike Fargen, who's the director of that, who's just releasing a system for all of us to be able to access and get a better understanding of these things. But my theory is that, I mean, as people are kept longer, you don't churn through the system. They end up holding a bed for a longer period of time. That's what's driving it. There's been some really good studies out there, and I read a book recently, and I gave it to some senators and sent it to Director Frakes too, a link to it, talking about life sentences and how more people, if you go back in time 40 years ago or 30 years ago and see what percentage of people were put in for life, it was very small. And now we have a lot of people that get like a life to life or 10 to life, 20 years to life, things like that. And then they stay for a long time. If you talk to some of the older inmates, they'll talk about how they knew somebody who was in for 10 to life or 20 to life, and they got paroled after 15 years. Well, now that doesn't happen.
Especially when you're giving people double life in that. And again, what is that really saying? And the thing I find almost strange, if not like draconian, when you say to someone, "We're going to give you double life," but then you turn around because somebody has white skin, you give them a year for killing somebody. I've seen that happen in Omaha, where young guys years ago they got into a fight, stabbed a guy, and he was in prison for 1 year, whereas other people got 7 years. And then you look at the case of Mondo and Pondexter and so on. And,
Yeah.
obviously it was the police officers they say were involved. But looking at the police department back in those days and those cases, you question certain these things, so on and so on. We're down to the last minute or so, and I want to just ask you, do you have any closing comment, Doug, for our viewing audience?
Oh, yeah, I think I would just want people to know that I'm out here, that I'm looking at the correctional system, and I would welcome any input that people have. They can look me up on the legislature's website. I'm in there. They can call me at 402-471-4215 or email me, um, and share their thoughts with me. I love to hear what people have to think and want to learn more. And I've learned a lot in my 5+ years on this job, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 years. And I think it's important work. Um, and I keep the systems accountable, parole and corrections. Next week I'm meeting, or no, tomorrow I'm meeting with the person who runs parole administration and everything. We're going to sit down and talk about a lot of different things. So I need to hold them accountable, but I also need people to hold me accountable. Ajmal, you're helping hold me accountable. I think other people are too. So I welcome that. And I really enjoyed our time together.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. The other thing, Doug, I just suggest is as we start to do these programs more so, we'll put information on our websites, Facebook pages, some of us who have those. But what we're always about is trying to get more people engaged in the struggle, because at the end of the day, we need more people to do the heavy lifting, and we can't count on the few to do the work for the many. And again, we understand about fairness, justice, anti-racism, and all those kind of things. But it means that we're going to have to be able to put our efforts and our talents where our mouth is at, in terms of we can talk about it, but we got to be about it. So really appreciate you being on this more program today. And like I said, we'll post this on our webpage, do a search on this, and hopefully we'll get a chance to bring you back to get another update from time to
Okay.
time on what's going on, and how we can get more people in our state involved in how to reform our system. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Take care.
Good. We hope you enjoyed this edition of our program that deals with some of the issues related to community correction systems and so on. And Doug Koebernick was very much helpful in that. And so really thank him for doing that. So thank you very much, and join us again next time.